Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the cold, candlelit corridors of Tudor England, where the throne wasn't so much a seat of power as a beautifully upholstered ejector seat. We're telling the story of Lady Jane Grey, the teenage girl who became Queen of England for roughly 9 days, which is about the same length of time most of us manage to keep a New Year's resolution. A huge and heartfelt thank you to the lovely viewer who suggested this one. You keep this little channel alive, and your ideas really do shape what gets made here. So if you're enjoying these late-night wanders into history's stranger corners, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is, because somehow it's always far too late somewhere. We're also now on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off with just my voice and no glowing screen, the link is waiting in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft hum, and get comfortable. Let's wonder for a moment. Have you ever been handed a job you never applied for by people who very much did not have your best interests at heart? Ever been the smartest, most prepared person in the room and somehow still had the worst week of anyone there? Ever been promoted on a Monday and quietly disappeared by Wednesday? Could you stay calm if your parents, your in-laws, and a dying boy king all decided the entire course of your life before you'd finish breakfast? Well, get comfortable, because we're travelling back to England in the 1530s, to a kingdom where being born a little too close to the crown wasn't a blessing. It was a slow, polite, beautifully dressed death sentence. Around the year 1537, in the green and rolling deer park of Bradgate in Leicestershire, a girl was born who would inherit something far more dangerous than money or land. She inherited Tudor blood. Her name was Jane Grey, and through her mother, Frances Brandon, she was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII and the grandniece of the towering, terrifying Henry VIII. To most families, a drop of royal blood was a treasure. To the Greys, it was a lottery ticket they could never stop scratching. Because in Tudor England, being close to the throne meant you were either destined for greatness or marked for the block, and the line between the two was thinner than a sheet of parchment. To understand just how dangerous Jane's birth truly was, you have to follow the tangled thread of her ancestry. Her grandmother was Mary Tudor, the beautiful younger sister of Henry VIII, once briefly Queen of France, and forever after a glittering ornament of the English court. When Mary married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, she folded royal blood into a noble house, and that blood passed down to her daughter Frances, and then to little Jane. It meant that Jane was not some distant cousin lost in the branches of the family tree. She sat uncomfortably close to the trunk, close enough that careful men with long memories took notice, and there was paperwork to make it worse. When Henry VIII drew up his final will, he laid out the order of succession with the precision of a man arranging chess pieces he expected to outlive. First would come his son Edward, then his daughter Mary, then Elizabeth. And after them, should that unlikely string of misfortunes ever come to pass, the crown could descend to the heirs of his younger sister Mary, which is to say, the Grey Line. Henry almost certainly imagined this clause as a polite formality, a just-in-case tucked away at the bottom of the page. He could not have dreamed that one day it would be dusted off, twisted, and used to crown a teenage girl who wanted nothing to do with it. Bradgate itself was a place of quiet grandeur, all red brick and tall chimneys set against the wild green of the surrounding park, where deer moved through the bracken and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. It was the kind of home that announced a family's importance to anyone who approached. But importance in that century was a double-edged thing. The same blood that filled the house with fine furnishings and ambitious visitors also painted a quiet target on every cradle. A noble girl with royal lineage was not simply a child to be raised, she was a resource to be guarded, displayed, and one day spent. Jane, of course, knew none of this in her earliest years. She was simply a small girl in a great house, surrounded by servants and tapestries and the constant low hum of her parents' ambition. But the forces that would eventually destroy her were already in place before she could even speak. The bloodline was set. The will was written. The crown sat far away in London, glittering and lethal, waiting with the patience of a trap. She had been born into the wrong family at the worst possible moment in English history, and the most remarkable thing of all is that for a few short years she was almost allowed to forget it. Almost. Jane was, by almost every account, astonishingly clever. While other noble girls were taught to curtsy, embroider, and keep their opinions tucked safely out of sight, Jane devoured languages the way other children devoured sweets. She read and wrote in Latin and Greek, dabbled in Hebrew, and could hold her own in conversation with the finest scholars in the kingdom. Learning wasn't a chore for her, it was an escape. Because for all the privilege of her birth, the house she grew up in was not a warm one, and books, unlike her parents, never raised their voices. Her education was, by the standards of the day, almost shockingly thorough. Tudor noblewomen were generally taught just enough to manage a household, sign their names, and appear graceful at court. Jane blew past those modest expectations before most children her age had finished learning their letters. Under the guidance of able tutors, most notably the gentle and learned John Aylmer, she worked through the great texts of the ancient world, passing philosophy and scripture with a focus that left grown men astonished. Visitors who came expecting a pretty, well-mannered girl often left having been quietly outmatched in debate by someone barely tall enough to reach the table. What made her brilliance even more remarkable was how genuinely she seemed to love it. For Jane, study was not a duty grudgingly performed to please her elders. It was the one corner of her life that belonged entirely to her, a place no parent could scold and no marriage contract could touch. When she opened a book, the cold formalities of the house fell away, and she could lose herself in a world ordered by reason and meaning rather than by ambition and fear. In an existence where almost everything was decided for her, the life of the mind was the single freedom she was allowed to keep. But it would be a mistake to imagine Jane as some serene scholar gliding contentedly through a golden childhood. The house at Bradgate, for all its learning, was a place of relentless expectation. Her parents prized her gifts not as wonders to be nurtured, but as proof that their investment was paying off. A daughter who could converse in 3 languages and dazzle visiting dignitaries was a daughter worth showing off, and the pressure to perform, to be perfect, to never embarrass the family, pressed down on Jane like a weight she was never permitted to set aside. There is something quietly heartbreaking in the image of a small girl finding her only comfort in the company of long-dead philosophers. While the rest of the household chased pleasure and advancement, Jane sat with her books, building an inner world rich enough to make the outer one bearable. Her intelligence, which should have been a source of pure joy, became instead a kind of armour, a way of withdrawing from people who saw her as a tool rather than a child. In later years, those same skills would make her one of the most learned women in all of England, admired by reformers and scholars across Europe. But admiration, as Jane would discover, offered very little protection. A sharp mind could win you respect, correspondence with famous thinkers, and a reputation that outlived you by centuries. What it could not do was save you from the people who shared your own roof, or from the ambitions they had already begun to weave around your future. For now, though, Jane read on by candlelight, quietly brilliant in a house that valued her gifts for all the wrong reasons. Behind the tapestries and the fine gowns, Jane's childhood was ruled by a discipline that bordered on cruelty. Her parents, ambitious and rigid, expected perfection at every turn, and they were not shy about correcting anything less. Jane herself later described being pinched, nipped, and scolded for the smallest misstep. treated as though even a moment of childish imperfection were a personal insult to the family name. To them, she wasn't simply a daughter. She was an investment, a polished asset to be displayed, and assets, as everyone knew, were not allowed to slouch. The standards she was held to were impossibly precise. Whether she was sitting or standing, eating or speaking, sewing or dancing, there was a correct way to do it, and any deviation, however slight, was met not with patience, but with punishment. By her own later account, if she did not perform every task as perfectly as the world itself was made, she was sharply taunted, threatened, and physically corrected with pinches and blows, until she felt herself in something close to hell. It is a startling phrase from a girl of her position, and it offers a rare, painful glimpse behind the polished surface of noble life. What makes the cruelty more striking is the contrast it created within her own days. Jane's tutor was kind, encouraging, and patient, treating her as a mind worth cultivating rather than a child to be broken. Her parents were the opposite. The result was a strange and lonely tension. The schoolroom became a sanctuary and the family chambers a place of dread, and Jane learned to navigate between the two with the wary instincts of someone who never quite knew which version of authority she would meet around the next corner. It would be easy, from a comfortable distance of nearly 5 centuries, to dismiss all this as ordinary for the age. Tudor parenting was not gentle, and discipline was expected to be firm. But even by the rough standards of her time, the harshness Jane described stood out, and it left its mark. She grew into a young woman of unusual seriousness and self-possession, composed far beyond her years, carrying herself with a gravity that could seem almost cold to those who did not understand its origins. When you are raised to expect correction at every turn, you learn very quickly to give no one a reason to correct you. There is a grim logic to it all, of course. Jane's parents were not cruel for the sake of cruelty. They were ambitious to the point of obsession, and they saw in their gifted daughter the family's best hope of climbing higher. Every pinch, every threat, every sharp word was, in their twisted reasoning, an act of investment. They were shaping a flawless product, a daughter so accomplished and so impeccable that she might one day be placed beside greatness, perhaps even beside the throne itself. The irony, as bitter as any in her story, is that all their careful moulding would indeed carry her to a crown, and that crown would cost her everything. So Jane endured, as children of her era so often had to, finding what comfort she could in her studies and offering the world the calm, faultless surface her parents demanded. Beneath the silk and the learning, she was a girl being relentlessly forged into something useful, and the people doing the forging had no idea that the masterpiece they were so determined to create would one day be carried, perfect and serene, all the way to the scaffold. One famous afternoon captured the strange loneliness of Jane's world. When a visiting scholar named Roger Ascham arrived at the estate, he found the entire family out hunting in the park, chasing deer and laughing in the autumn air. Everyone, that is, except Jane, who sat quietly indoors reading Plato in the original Greek. When Ascham asked why she wasn't out enjoying the sport with the others, she gave an answer that has echoed through history. The pleasure she found in her book was greater than anything the hunt could offer. It was a glimpse of a remarkable young mind, and a quiet hint of just how far she felt from the people who were supposed to love her. Ascham, one of the most respected educators of the age, had stopped at Bradgate during his travels, and what he witnessed there stayed with him for the rest of his life. The grand household stood half empty, its corridors echoing, while out in the park the hunting party shouted and galloped after the deer, and there, alone in a quiet room, sat a young girl bent over one of the most demanding texts ever written, working through the dense Greek of Plato's Phaedo, as easily as another child might read a simple rhyme. The scene was so striking that Ascham later recorded it, and through his pen it became one of the most enduring images in all of Tudor history. When he gently pressed her on why she had chosen study over the pleasures of the hunt, Jane's reply revealed more than she perhaps intended. She told him, in effect, that the joy others found in their sport was nothing compared to the joy she found in her books, and then she said something far more telling. She explained that one of the few real pleasures in her life was the time spent with her gentle, learned tutor, because when she was with her parents, she was held to such cruel and exacting standards that she felt she could do nothing right. Her studies were not merely a hobby. They were the place where she was, at last, treated with kindness. It is a quiet, devastating exchange. Beneath the scholarly admiration lies the portrait of a child who had learned to seek refuge in the company of the dead and the distant, because the living people closest to her offered so little warmth. The famous quote, so often repeated as proof of her brilliance, is really a confession of loneliness dressed in the language of learning. Jane preferred Plato to the deer park not only because she loved knowledge, but because knowledge never pinched her, never threatened her, never demanded a perfection she could never quite reach. For Ascham, the encounter confirmed everything he believed about education and gentleness, and he would hold Jane up for years afterward as an example of what a young mind could become when it was nurtured rather than beaten. He saw in her a brilliance that needed only encouragement to flourish, and he lamented that so many children were instead driven from learning by harshness and fear. What neither of them could see, on that bright autumn afternoon, was the future that brilliance would buy her. The same qualities that so impressed the scholar, the seriousness, the composure, the unshakable inner conviction, would one day carry her with terrible dignity through a trial and onto a scaffold. The girl who found such comfort in her books would face her death with the same calm she brought to her studies. But all of that lay far ahead, for now there was only the quiet room, the open book, and a lonely young mind choosing, as it always did, the one companion that never let her down. If books were Jane's refuge, her religion was her backbone. She was a devout and deeply serious Protestant in an age when faith was not a private matter, but a question of life and death. Where some treated belief as a fashion that changed with whoever sat on the throne, Jane held to hers with the unbending certainty of someone twice her age. This conviction would shape everything about her, how she lived, how others tried to use her, and ultimately how she died. In a kingdom torn between the old faith and the new, Jane had chosen her side, and she would not be moved. To grasp how dangerous and how defining this was, you have to understand the religious storm that raged across England in Jane's lifetime. Her great-uncle Henry VIII had famously broken with the Pope and Rome, but largely for reasons of marriage and power rather than deep theological conviction. It was under the young King Edward, Henry's son, that England truly began to embrace the Protestant Reformation in earnest, sweeping away old rituals, stripping altars, and remaking the very soul of the nation's worship. Jane came of age in the very heart of this transformation, and she absorbed its ideas not as policy, but as truth. Her belief was no shallow thing. She read scripture in its original languages, debated fine points of doctrine with confidence, and corresponded with leading reformers on the continent, including the influential Swiss theologian Heinrich Bullinger, who was deeply impressed by the learning and devotion of so young an Englishwoman. While other girls her age were mastering the lute, Jane was wrestling with questions of salvation, grace, and the proper nature of worship, and she did so with a rigour that earned her genuine respect among Europe's most serious thinkers. This faith gave her something that all the wealth and bloodline in the world could not, a sense of unshakable inner certainty. In a court built on flattery, shifting alliances, and convenient convictions, Jane was that rarest and most awkward of things, a true believer. She had little patience for those who bent their religion to suit the moment, and she could be sharp, even scornful, toward what she saw as hollow ceremony or hypocrisy. It was the boldness of youth fused with the conviction of a zealot, and it made her admirable, formidable, and quietly inconvenient all at once. There is a famous story from later in her brief and tragic public life of Jane reacting with open disapproval when she believed a companion had shown reverence to the consecrated bread of the Catholic Mass. To Jane, such an act was not a small social nicety, but a betrayal of everything she held sacred. Her faith was not flexible, and she was not inclined to pretend otherwise, even when discretion might have served her far better. That same iron conviction would make her enormously useful to ambitious men. In a struggle between a Protestant future and a Catholic restoration, a devout, learned, royal-blooded Protestant girl was exactly the kind of figure that schemers could rally behind, a living symbol of the cause. Jane's sincerity, so pure and so genuine, would be cynically exploited by those who saw her beliefs not as something to honour, but as something to weaponize. And in the end, her faith would be both her cage and her crown of glory. It would help place her in mortal danger, and it would carry her through that danger with extraordinary courage. When everything else had been stripped away, her belief remained steady and unbroken, the one possession no one could take from her until the very last moment. As Jane grew, she was sent away to be raised in the household of Katherine Parr, the clever and kind-hearted sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, now a widow. For a brief and precious time, Jane found something close to happiness. Katherine was warm, intelligent, and a champion of education for women, and under her roof Jane was nurtured rather than corrected. It was perhaps the only home she ever knew that felt safe, but safety in Tudor England was a fragile, fleeting thing, and the man Katherine had chosen to marry would soon turn that warm household into something far more dangerous. The arrangement was, on its surface, an enormous honour. To be placed in the care of the Dowager Queen, the very woman who'd survived marriage to the most fearsome king in Europe, was a mark of the family's standing and a glittering opportunity for advancement. But for Jane, who'd grown up under the cold and exacting eyes of her parents, it was something far more meaningful than mere prestige. It was, for the first time, a household where her gifts were celebrated with affection, rather than weaponized through pressure. Katherine Parr was a remarkable woman, learned in her own right, and genuinely devoted to the education of young people. She had been a quiet force for reform during her time as queen, surrounding herself with scholars and thinkers, and she believed deeply that a sharp mind was a gift to be cultivated, not feared. Under her influence, Jane could continue her studies in an atmosphere of encouragement, sharing her home with a woman who valued exactly the qualities her own parents had so often punished. For a girl starved of warmth, it must have felt like stepping out of a long winter and into the sun. The household moved between elegant residences, and life there was rich with conversation, music, and the steady rhythm of learning. Jane was treated with a tenderness she had rarely known, given the space to grow not merely as an asset, but as a person. Katherine, who had no surviving children of her own from her royal marriage, seems to have taken a genuine maternal interest in the serious, brilliant girl placed in her care. In this gentle environment, Jane flourished, and for a short while the long shadow of her dangerous bloodline seemed to lift. But the Queen's household was not the simple haven it first appeared. Not long after the old king's death, Katherine had remarried, and her new husband was a man of dazzling charm and bottomless ambition, named Thomas Seymour. Handsome, reckless, and consumed by a hunger for power, Seymour saw the people around him not as family but as opportunities, and a young girl with royal blood under his own roof was an opportunity of the most tempting kind. So even as Jane found comfort in Katherine's care, a colder calculation was already taking shape around her. The the same household that offered her warmth was becoming, without her knowledge, a stage for schemes far beyond a teenage girl's understanding. The kindness was real, but it was woven through with danger, and the man who controlled the household had plans for Jane that had nothing to do with her happiness and everything to do with his own rise. For now, though, Jane could not see the trap forming. She knew only that, after years of cold correction, she had at last found a place where she was loved and her mind was prized. It was the closest thing to peace her short life would ever offer. And like nearly every good thing that ever came to Jane Grey, it would not be allowed to last. Katherine Parr's new husband was Thomas Seymour, a charming, reckless, and breathtakingly ambitious man who saw in young Jane not a child to protect but a piece to play. Seymour purchased Jane's wardship from her eager parents, dangling the dazzling possibility that he might one day marry her off to the young King Edward himself. To Jane's family it was an irresistible dream. To Seymour it was a gamble in a much larger game of power. And to Jane, caught in the middle, it was the beginning of a pattern that would define her short life, being moved across the board by men who saw a crown where they should have seen a girl. Thomas Seymour was, in many ways, the architect of his own destruction, but he was a dangerous architect indeed. He was the brother of Jane Seymour, the late Queen who had given Henry his longed-for son, which made him uncle to the young King Edward, and brother to the powerful Lord Protector who now governed the realm in the boy king's name. Seymour, however, was not content to bask in his family's glory from the sidelines. He burned with resentment at his brother's greater power and schemed endlessly to increase his own, and in Jane he saw a perfect instrument for his ambitions. The practice of wardship, by which the control over a wealthy or well-born minor could be bought and sold, was a normal feature of the age, but Seymour pursued Jane's with unusual eagerness. He paid handsomely for the right to oversee her future, and he sweetened the deal for her grasping parents with a promise too tempting to refuse, that under his guidance he might arrange for Jane to marry the king. The idea that their daughter could become Queen of England, not through some distant clause in a will, but through an actual royal marriage, set the Greys' ambitions ablaze. They handed Jane over with delight, seeing not a transfer of a child, but the purchase of a golden future. For Jane, this meant that her life once again was being decided in rooms she was not invited into, by men weighing her worth like merchants appraising goods. She remained, for the time being, within the warm orbit of Katherine Parr, and so the danger was not yet obvious to her. But the calculations had begun. She was no longer simply a beloved member of a learned household. She was now a carefully held card in a high-stakes game, to be played at exactly the right moment for maximum advantage. Seymour's scheme was wildly audacious, and, in hindsight, hopelessly overreaching. The marriage of a king was the most important political decision in the kingdom, jealously guarded by the council and the Lord Protector, and the notion that Seymour could simply engineer such a match through private manoeuvring revealed both his boldness and his recklessness. He was a man who consistently mistook ambition for ability, confident that charm and cunning could carry him past every obstacle. They could not. Still, for as long as the dream held, Jane's stock had never been higher. She was the girl who might be queen, the centerpiece of a grand design, valued and protected precisely because of what she might one day be worth. It was a dangerous kind of importance, the sort that drew powerful eyes and powerful enemies, but it was importance all the same. What Jane could not know was how quickly such schemes could curdle. Thomas Seymour was playing a game far above his skill, against opponents far more ruthless than he understood. And when his luck finally ran out, as it surely would, the collapse would not be quiet, and it would not be kind. Thomas Seymour's ambitions burned too brightly and too recklessly to last. After Katherine Parr died in childbirth in 1548, His scheming spun completely out of control until he was arrested, charged with treason and executed in 1549. Jane, who had lost the one guardian who treated her with genuine kindness, was sent back to her parents and their relentless ambitions. The warm household was gone, the protector was dead, and Jane, still only a child, had already learned a brutal lesson about what happened to people who reached too close to the throne. The death of Katherine Parr was a genuine tragedy, both for the kingdom and for Jane personally. The Dowager Queen died not long after giving birth to a daughter, struck down by the same childbed fever that claimed so many women of the age, regardless of rank or wealth. With her death, the warm and learned household that had sheltered Jane simply dissolved. The woman who had nurtured her, championed her studies, and offered her something close to maternal love was gone, and with her went the brief, sunlit chapter of Jane's life. It is a poignant detail that Jane served as chief mourner at Catherine's funeral, a young girl leading the rites for the one adult who had shown her real tenderness. With Katherine in her grave, the fragile structure of Jane's situation collapsed, and Thomas Seymour was left without the respectable cover his marriage had provided. Freed from any restraining influence, his ambitions ran wild. He plotted, schemed, and overreached in increasingly desperate ways, attempting to undermine his own brother, the Lord Protector, and to seize greater control over the young king. His behaviour grew so reckless that even his allies could not protect him, and in time his actions crossed the unforgivable line into outright treason. The end came swiftly and without mercy. Seymour was arrested, and the long list of his offences was laid bare. The man who had bought a royal-blooded girl in hopes of crowning her, who had dreamed of marrying her to a king and ruling through the Union, was condemned and put to death. His grand designs, which had once made Jane the most valuable child in England, vanished in an instant, leaving nothing behind but a cautionary tale about the price of reaching too high. For Jane, the consequences were immediate and bleak. With her guardian executed and her benefactress dead, there was nowhere for her to go but back to Bradgate and the cold embrace of her parents. The contrast could not have been crueler. She had tasted warmth, encouragement, and the gentle company of people who valued her for herself, and now she was returned to the relentless ambition and exacting standards of the very household she had once escaped. The sanctuary was gone and the cage had reopened. But Jane took something with her from those years beyond the grief. She had now watched, up close, how the great game was played, and how brutally it could end. She had seen a charming, powerful man dream of crowns and bloodlines, only to lose his head on the block for it. She had learned, in the most personal way imaginable, that proximity to the throne was not a privilege but a peril, and that the same ambition which lifted people up could just as easily destroy them. It was a lesson written in the blood of the man who had bought her, and the deepest tragedy of Jane's story is that despite having learned it so young and so well, she would not be able to escape its grip. The game was not finished with her, it had in truth barely begun. Back under her parents' roof, Jane was once again treated as a prize to be positioned. Her family's hunger for advancement had not faded. If anything, it had sharpened. Every conversation about her future was really a conversation about their own. Every potential match weighed not for her happiness, but for the doors it might open. Jane was intelligent enough to understand exactly what she was to them, and powerless enough to do nothing about it. In a world where noblewomen were currency, Jane was simply the most valuable coin her family owned, and they intended to spend her well. The return to Bradgate marked a return to the old pressures, but the stakes had grown even higher. Jane was no longer a small child to be moulded. She was a young woman of marriageable age, accomplished, royal-blooded and Protestant, exactly the kind of asset that could be leveraged into enormous advantage if played correctly. Her parents understood this perfectly, and they set about treating her future as a negotiation, the way one might haggle over the sale of a prized piece of land. The only difference was that the land had feelings, opinions, and a mind sharper than most of the people bargaining over it. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how completely Jane's wishes were absent from these calculations. In our own age, we like to imagine that young people steer their own destinies, choosing their paths and their partners according to their hearts. Jane enjoyed no such luxury. Her marriage, her household, her religion's place in the realm, even the title she might one day hold, all of it was subject to the ambitions of others. She was a person of extraordinary gifts and almost no agency, a brilliant mind locked inside a life entirely controlled by people who saw her as a means to an end. Her father, raised to a dukedom and ever eager to climb higher, and her formidable mother, who carried the precious Tudor blood in her own veins, viewed their gifted daughter as the family's surest path to greatness. They had invested years of discipline and education into her, shaping her into a flawless instrument, and now they meant to collect on that investment. The question was never whether Jane would be used to advance the family, but only when, how, and with whom. There is a cold efficiency to it that can feel almost monstrous to modern eyes, yet it was entirely ordinary for the time. Noble daughters across Europe were bartered in exactly this way, their bodies and bloodlines traded in the great marketplace of dynastic ambition. Love, when it appeared at all, was a happy accident rather than a goal. Jane's situation was unusual only in the height of the stakes, for her blood placed her tantalizingly close to the most valuable prize of all, the crown itself, and so Jane waited, composed and watchful, as the adults around her plotted her future. She had learned long ago to keep her own counsel, to present a calm and faultless surface while keeping her true thoughts locked safely away. Whatever fears or hopes stirred behind that serene expression, she revealed little of them. She had no power to change her fate, and she was far too clever to waste energy fighting battles she could not win. What she likely did not yet fully grasp was the scale of the design now forming around her. This would be no ordinary noble marriage arranged for land or status. The most ruthless and powerful man in England was about to take an interest in the gifted grey girl, and he was not thinking about advantageous matches or family prestige. He was thinking about a throne, and he had already decided who would sit on it. While the Greys schemed in the shadows, a far more dangerous man was weaving his own web at the very heart of power. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had clawed his way to the top of King Edward's government, becoming the most powerful man in England in everything but name. Cold, calculating, and ruthlessly intelligent, he understood that the young king's health was failing, and that whoever controlled the succession would control the kingdom. Northumberland did not intend to lose that control, and to keep it, he would need a queen he could shape, a queen with royal blood and very little power of her own. He had just the girl in mind. Dudley's rise had been a masterclass in ambition. He had outmanoeuvred his rivals one by one, including the very Lord Protector, who had once governed in the young king's name, and he had positioned himself as the indispensable power behind the throne. He held no formal title as regent, but in practice the machinery of the kingdom answered to him. He controlled access to the king, shaped the decisions of the council, and bent the apparatus of government toward his own designs. He was, in short, the spider at the centre of England's web, feeling every tremor along its threads. But Northumberland's power rested on a single, terrifyingly fragile foundation, the life of King Edward. The young king was the source of all his authority, the lawful sovereign in whose name he ruled. And by the early months of 1553, it had become horribly clear that the boy was dying. A vicious illness, almost certainly tuberculosis, was consuming him from the inside, and no physician could halt its progress. Northumberland watched the king's decline with the cold focus of a man calculating his own survival, because he understood exactly what would happen to him the moment Edward drew his final breath. The next in line, according to Henry VIII's will and the laws of the realm, was Edward's half-sister Mary, a devout and unyielding Catholic. For Northumberland, this was nothing short of catastrophe. Mary loathed the Protestant reforms he had championed, and she had every reason to despise the man who had ruled in her brother's name. Should she take the throne, Northumberland could expect not gratitude but ruin, and quite possibly the executioner's block. His entire future, and very likely his life, depended on keeping the crown out of Mary's hands. And so the spider began to spin a new and audacious web. If the lawful heir threatened his destruction, then the law of succession would simply have to be changed. He needed a candidate with a genuine claim to royal blood, a candidate who was reliably Protestant, and above all a candidate young and powerless enough to be moulded entirely to his will. As he surveyed the field, his cold eyes settled on a single figure, the brilliant, devout, royal-blooded teenager named Jane Grey. She was, from Northumberland's ruthless perspective, very nearly perfect. Her Tudor descent gave her a plausible claim. Her fervent Protestantism made her acceptable to the reformers, and crucially to the dying king himself. And her youth and lack of independent power meant that whoever controlled her would, in effect, control the kingdom. To Northumberland, Jane was not a person to be considered, but a solution to be implemented, the answer to the desperate problem of his own survival. All that remained was to bind her tightly to his own house, to convince a dying boy to do the unthinkable, and to spring the trap before anyone could stop him. The web was nearly complete, and at its centre, unaware of just how thoroughly she had already been chosen, sat Jane, soon to be caught in thread she had never seen and could never escape. In May of 1553, Jane was married to Lord Guilford Dudley, one of Northumberland's many sons, in a lavish ceremony she had no say in arranging. By most accounts, Jane resisted the match, but resistance from a teenage girl meant little against the combined will of two ambitious families. The wedding was not a celebration of love, but a political contract, a quiet locking of two bloodlines into a single dangerous design. Jane likely did not fully understand what the marriage was meant to accomplish, but Northumberland did, and the pieces of his plan were almost all in place. The wedding itself was a glittering affair, the kind of spectacle designed to impress the entire court and signal the rising power of the Dudley family. It took place at Durham House, one of the grand London residences, and it was not Jane's union alone that was celebrated that day. In a single sweeping arrangement, several marriages were sealed at once, binding the great families together in a web of alliances. Jane was wed to Guildford, her younger sister was matched to another noble heir, and a Dudley daughter was married off in turn. It was less a series of weddings than a corporate merger conducted in silk and gold, with the brides and grooms as the signatures on the contract. Guildford Dudley himself was a handsome young man, but by most descriptions a rather spoiled and unremarkable one, accustomed to getting his way and shaped heavily by his domineering father and mother. There was no great romance between him and Jane, no tender courtship or shared affection. They were two young people pushed together because their bloodlines and their families' ambitions happened to align at a critical moment. Whatever feelings either of them might have had were entirely beside the point. The marriage existed to serve a purpose, and that purpose had nothing to do with their happiness. Jane, by several accounts, did not go willingly. She is said to have objected to the match, perhaps sensing the dangerous machinery she was being fed into, perhaps simply recoiling at having yet another enormous decision made for her without her consent. But her objections were brushed aside with the firm, familiar pressure she had known her whole life. Her parents wanted the marriage, the Dudleys wanted the marriage, and the most powerful man in England wanted the marriage. Against that combined weight, the wishes of a girl of 15 or 16 counted for precisely nothing. It is one of the quiet cruelties of her story that Jane could be so brilliant, so admired across Europe for her learning, and yet so utterly unable to direct the most basic course of her own life. She could debate theology with continental scholars, but she could not refuse a husband. She could read Plato in Greek, but she could not say no to a wedding. Her gifts won her respect. They never won her freedom. What Jane could not see, standing through the long ceremonies in her fine wedding clothes, was the true shape of the trap closing around her. To her, perhaps, it seemed merely another arranged marriage of the sort that noble girls endured all the time, unpleasant and unwanted, but survivable. She did not yet understand that her new father-in-law was not thinking about land or status or family prestige. He was thinking about a dying king, an empty throne, and a crown that he intended to place very soon upon her unwilling head. The marriage was the final piece Northumberland needed to bind Jane to his house. With the ink dry on the contract, the spider had only to wait for the king to die. At the centre of everything lay a sick bed, and in that bed lay a dying child. King Edward VI, Henry VIII's long-awaited son, was only 15 years old and wasting away from a brutal illness, almost certainly tuberculosis. He was a fiercely devout Protestant, and as he lay coughing his life away, one thought tormented him above all others, that the crown would pass to his Catholic half-sister Mary, who would surely undo everything his reign had built. The boy king wanted to protect his faith. Northumberland wanted to protect his power. And in that desperate overlap of motives, Jane's fate was about to be sealed. Edward had come to the throne as a child of 9, the precious only son for whom Henry VIII had upended a kingdom and discarded a wife. He had been raised as the great hope of the Protestant cause, educated by reformers, surrounded by men who shaped him into a passionate champion of the new religion. For a frail boy, he possessed a remarkably hard and serious mind, and he took his role as the defender of England's Reformed Church with absolute conviction. The reforms enacted in his name had transformed worship across the country, and to Edward, undoing them would be nothing less than a betrayal of God. But by the early months of 1553 it was painfully clear that the young king would not live to defend his life's work. He had fallen gravely ill, and his condition deteriorated through the spring with terrifying speed. The disease ravaging him, most likely a violent consumption of the lungs, left him weak, feverish, and racked with coughing. Reports of his suffering grew grimmer by the week, and the physicians, for all their efforts, could offer nothing but the grim certainty that the end was approaching. For a dying boy of 15, the prospect of death itself was terrible enough. But Edward's torment was sharpened by what would come after. By the law of his own father's will, the crown would pass to his half-sister Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and Mary was an unshakable Catholic. To Edward, this meant that the moment he closed his eyes for the last time, everything he had built, the reformed faith of his entire reign, would be torn down and the old religion restored. The thought was unbearable to him, a defeat snatched from the jaws of his short, devout life. Here was where the desperate young king and the calculating duke found their interests aligning with deadly precision. Edward was tormented by religion and legacy. Northumberland was tormented by the certainty of his own ruin under Mary's rule. The boy wanted to save the Protestant future of England. The Duke wanted to save himself, and both of them, for their very different reasons, arrived at the same forbidden conclusion. The lawful succession would have to be set aside, and a new heir installed in Mary's place. It is worth remembering that Edward was, in the end, still a child, however serious and devout. He was frightened, he was dying, and he was desperate to ensure that his faith survived him. Whether the radical scheme that followed sprang first from his own anguished mind, or was carefully nurtured by the men around him, is a question that has never been fully settled. Almost certainly it was some grim collaboration of the two, the genuine fears of a dying boy shaped and steered by the ambition of those who stood to lose everything. Either way, the result was the same. Pen and parchment were brought to the sick room, and the boy king prepared to do something no will alone should ever have been able to do. In his final months, the dying Edward drafted an extraordinary document, a handwritten plan that came to be known as the Devise for the Succession. In it, the young king attempted to do something no will should have been able to do, rewrite the line of inheritance set down by his own father and by Parliament itself. He named Jane Grey as his heir, leapfrogging her over his two half-sisters. Whether the idea was truly his own or carefully planted by Northumberland is a question historians still debate. But the result was the same. A few strokes of a dying boy's pen had just placed a crown over Jane's head and a noose around her neck. The document itself survives, and it is a strange and revealing thing. Written in Edward's own hand, it began as a plan to leave the crown to the male heirs of the Grey women, the sons Jane and her sisters might one day bear. But there was a glaring problem with this. Edward was dying now, in a matter of weeks, and Jane had no sons. Indeed, she had only just been married. To wait for theoretical future grandsons was useless when the king's life was measured in days. So the document was altered, and the alteration is one of the most telling details in the entire affair. The original phrase, which left the crown to Jane's heirs male, was changed to leave it to Jane herself and her heirs male. A few inserted words transformed an abstract plan about unborn boys into an immediate practical scheme to crown a living teenage girl. That small amendment squeezed into the text was the moment the whole desperate design snapped into focus. It was no longer about some distant Protestant future. It was about putting Jane on the throne the instant Edward died. The legality of the entire thing was, to put it gently, deeply questionable. Henry VIII had set the order of succession in his will, an arrangement backed by an Act of Parliament. For Edward to override that with a personal document, however earnestly written, flew in the face of the law of the realm. A king's will did not simply trump the will of his father and the authority of Parliament, and the leading lawyers and judges of the day knew it. When they were summoned and pressed to give the scheme their blessing, many of them balked, frightened by both its illegality and its danger. But a dying king, especially one steered by the most powerful man in the kingdom, was not easily refused. Edward, weak as he was, applied pressure with all the authority of the crown, and Northumberland applied pressure of his own, far less gentle in nature. The judges and councillors were cajoled, threatened, and worn down until, one by one, most of them set their names to the document, however reluctantly. They signed not because they believed in its legality, but because the alternative was to defy a king on his deathbed and a duke at the height of his power. And so the trap was built plank by plank, signature by signature. With each name added to the parchment, Jane was bound more tightly to a fate she had not chosen, and very likely didn't yet fully understand. The men in that sick room were not thinking of her as a person. They were thinking of religion, of power, of their own survival, and Jane was simply the instrument through which all of it would be secured. The document was finished. The signatures were gathered. All that remained now was for the dying boy to die, and for the men around him to spring the trap before the rest of England could react. To make Jane queen, two women had to be erased from the line of succession: Mary and Elizabeth, Henry VIII's own daughters. Both had at various points been declared illegitimate, and Edward's devise leaned heavily on that old technicality to brush them aside. On paper it looked almost tidy. In reality it was a reckless gamble, because Mary in particular was beloved by much of the country, fiercely determined and not at all the sort of woman to quietly accept being written out of history. By cutting the sisters from the story, Northumberland had not removed his enemies. He had simply given them a reason to fight. The legal pretext for sweeping the sisters aside was an old and convenient wound. Years earlier, in the chaos of Henry VIII's endless marital dramas, both Mary and Elizabeth had at different points been declared illegitimate, the products of unions the king had later decided were no marriages at all. Mary had been cast aside when Henry discarded her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth had suffered the same fate when her mother, Anne Boleyn, fell from grace and lost her head. Though Henry had later restored both daughters to the line of succession in his will, the old declarations of illegitimacy could still be dredged up and pointed to by anyone seeking a justification. This was the technicality that Edward's device exploited. If Mary and Elizabeth were illegitimate, the argument ran, then they had no rightful claim to the throne, and the crown could pass instead to the next legitimate Protestant heir, which was held to be Jane. It was a clever piece of legal contortion, the kind of reasoning that looks neat enough when written down by lawyers in a quiet room and falls apart the moment it collides with reality. And the reality was this: the people of England did not particularly care about the fine print. To a great many ordinary subjects, Mary was simply the daughter of King Henry, the rightful heir according to the old king's known wishes, and the legitimate next in line. The cleverness of the legal argument meant nothing against the deep instinctive sense of order and inheritance that ran through the country. You could declare Mary illegitimate on parchment all you liked, but you could not so easily erase her from the hearts of a people who knew exactly whose daughter she was. There was also the simple fact that Mary was no fragile victim to be quietly set aside. She was a woman of formidable will, hardened by decades of hardship, humiliation and danger. She had survived the fall of her mother, the loss of her status, years of being treated as an embarrassment and a threat, and she had emerged from all of it with her faith and her determination utterly intact. To imagine that such a woman would meekly accept being cut out of the succession by a hastily written document was a profound miscalculation. Mary had spent her whole life fighting to survive. She was not about to stop now. Elizabeth, the younger sister, was a subtler problem, clever and cautious and inclined to wait and watch. But it was Mary who posed the immediate danger, Mary who carried the weight of legitimacy in the eyes of the realm, and Mary whom Northumberland most needed to neutralise. By striking at her claim, he had not solved his problem. He had declared open war on a woman with nothing left to lose and a kingdom full of subjects who believed the throne was rightfully hers. In writing the sisters out of the story, the schemers had drawn a line in the sand. Now everything would depend on speed, on seizing Mary before she could rally the country to her side. And in that race, they were about to fall fatally behind. When King Edward finally died on the 6th of July, 1553, Northumberland did something cunning and deeply revealing. He kept it secret. For several days the death of the king was concealed while Northumberland scrambled to secure his plan, to gather his forces, and above all to get his hands on Mary before she could slip away and rally support. It was the move of a man who knew his scheme was fragile and his window was small. But Mary, ever watchful, sensed the danger and fled before the trap could close. The secret in the sick room had bought Northumberland time, but it had not bought him the one thing he needed most. The young king's death, when it came, was a release from terrible suffering. He had endured weeks of agony, his body wasted and ravaged by the disease consuming him, and at the last he slipped away, still only 15 years old. A boy who should have had decades of rule ahead of him was gone, leaving behind a kingdom poised on the edge of crisis, and a scheme that depended entirely on what happened in the hours and days that followed. Northumberland understood that the moment Edward's death became public knowledge, the whole country would look instinctively to Mary as the rightful heir. His entire plan hinged on preventing that instinct from taking hold, so he did the only thing he could. He held the news close, controlling who knew and when, buying himself precious time to put the final pieces in place. The king's death was, for those crucial days, a carefully guarded secret, hidden behind the walls of the palace while the machinery of the coup whirred frantically in the shadows. But the secret served two purposes, and the second was darker than the first. Northumberland did not merely want to delay the announcement. He wanted to lure Mary into his grasp before she understood what was happening. If he could get her to come to him, ideally to London, on some pretext, before she learned of her brother's death and her own danger, he could seize her, neutralise her, and crown Jane without a credible rival left standing. It was a clever and ruthless gambit, and for a moment it seemed it might work. Mary, however, was not so easily caught. Whether through her own sharp instincts, the warning of loyal friends, or simply a lifetime of learning to sense danger before it struck, she grasped that something was terribly wrong. Rather than walking into Northumberland's waiting arms, she turned and fled, riding hard into the countryside of East Anglia, away from the capital and toward the regions where her support was strongest. By the time the trap was meant to close, the prey had already vanished. This was the fatal crack in Northumberland's design. His entire scheme assumed control of information, control of the council, and above all control of Mary. With Mary loose in the country, beyond his reach and already gathering her thoughts and her allies, that control began to slip. The secret in the sick room had been a clever stroke, but cleverness was not enough. A scheme this audacious needed everything to go perfectly, and the very first essential step, the capture of Mary, had failed. Still, Northumberland pressed on because there was no longer any turning back. He had committed treason in all but name, and his only path now lay forward, through the crowning of Jane and the swift suppression of any resistance. The king was dead. The secret could not be kept forever, and the moment had come to reveal his queen to a kingdom that did not yet know it had lost its king. And so attention turned at last to the unwitting girl at the centre of it all, who was about to be told the news that would destroy her. When Jane was finally told that she was now Queen of England, she did not rejoice. She wept. By her own account, she was overwhelmed, frightened, and convinced the crown was not rightfully hers. She said to have collapsed, protesting that Mary was the true heir and that she herself was unworthy and unwilling. It was perhaps the most honest and clear-eyed moment of the entire affair, a teenage girl recognizing a poisoned chalice when it was pressed into her hands. But the adults around her had not spent years scheming to be stopped by the reluctance of the girl they had chosen. Willing or not, Jane was queen now. The scene of Jane being informed of her elevation is one of the most poignant in the whole story. She was brought before a gathering of the great men of the realm, the very councillors and nobles who had set their names to Edward's devise, and there she was told that the young king was dead and that she had been named his successor. The men knelt before her, addressing her as their sovereign, performing the rituals of homage to a girl who had wanted none of it. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it was a moment of horror. Jane's reaction was not the joy of a girl handed a kingdom, but the dread of a girl handed a death sentence. She is reported to have been so overcome that she fainted, sinking to the floor before the assembled lords. When she recovered herself, she did not embrace the crown. She refused it. She declared that the throne was not hers by right, that Mary was the lawful and rightful queen, and that she herself was neither worthy nor willing to take what did not belong to her. It was an astonishing display of conscience from a girl of 15 or 16, surrounded by the most powerful and ruthless men in England. Her protest, of course, changed nothing. The men who had engineered the coup were not about to be derailed by the moral clarity of the teenager they had selected precisely because she was supposed to be pliable. They pressed her. They reasoned with her. They invoked her duty to the Protestant faith, and the wishes of the dead king, and her own parents and her new husband's family added their weight to the pressure. Jane was a girl who had spent her entire life being overruled by the ambitions of her elders, and this was simply the largest and most fatal instance of it. In the end, worn down and trapped, she relented. She accepted the crown, though her acceptance was wrung from her rather than freely given. There is a story that even as she yielded, she prayed that if the throne was truly meant to be hers, God would grant her the grace to govern wisely, and that if it was not, he would forgive her. It is the kind of detail that captures her perfectly, a young woman of deep faith trying to find some moral foothold in a situation that had been entirely engineered without her consent. The tragedy of this moment is almost too sharp to bear. Jane saw, more clearly than any of the scheming men around her, the truth of her situation. She understood that the crown was not rightfully hers, that Mary was the legitimate heir, and that taking the throne was both a wrong and a danger. She said so plainly, and it made no difference at all. Her clear sight could not save her because she had no power to act on it. She had begged to refuse the crown. The crown had been forced upon her anyway, and with that, the doomed reign of Queen Jane was about to begin. On the 10th of July, 1553, Jane was formally proclaimed Queen of England. The proclamation was read aloud, the ceremonies performed, the machinery of monarchy set grandly in motion. And yet, from the very first moment, something felt wrong. The crowds that should have cheered stood largely silent, uneasy, unconvinced. There were no joyful bonfires, no ringing celebrations sweeping the country. Jane's reign began not with a roar, but with a held breath, a kingdom watching warily to see whether this strange new queen would last. The answer, as it turned out, would come with terrifying speed. The proclamation followed all the proper forms. Heralds read out the announcement in the streets of London, declaring Jane the rightful queen, and explaining in the careful legal language of the devise why the crown had passed to her rather than to Mary. The official apparatus of the state swung into action, and for a brief moment, on paper at least, England had a new sovereign. Jane was conducted with full ceremony to the Tower of London, as was the custom for monarchs awaiting their coronation, and the trappings of queenship were arranged around her. But ceremony is one thing, and the hearts of a people are another. The reaction in the streets was not the enthusiastic acclaim that should have greeted a new monarch. Instead, the crowds were notably cool, even hostile in places. There are accounts of the proclamation being met with sullen silence, of ordinary Londoners refusing to cheer, of unease rippling through the watching faces. To many this was simply wrong. They knew that Mary, daughter of King Henry, was the rightful heir, and no clever document read aloud by a herald could fully convince them otherwise. There is even a famous, grim story of a young man who dared to cry out publicly that Mary was the true queen, and who was savagely punished for it, his ears nailed to a pillory as a warning to others. Whether the tale is precisely accurate or not, it captures the atmosphere perfectly. This was not a joyful accession greeted with relief and celebration. It was a contested, anxious affair, propped up by force and legal argument, and the people sensed it. The silence in the streets was its own kind of verdict. For Jane, installed in the Tower as queen, these opening days must have been a strange and frightening blur. She was surrounded by the deference owed to a monarch, addressed as Your Majesty, attended by servants and counsellors, and yet she knew, perhaps better than anyone, how fragile her position truly was. She had not wanted the crown. She did not believe it was rightfully hers. and now she sat at the heart of a kingdom that, by and large, agreed with her doubts. The whole edifice of her reign rested on Northumberland's gamble that he could secure power before opposition could organise. Speed was everything. If Mary could be captured or her support scattered quickly enough, the proclamation would harden into reality, and Jane's queenship would become an accepted fact. But every day that Mary remained free and gathering strength was a day that the gamble looked worse. The held breath of the kingdom could not last forever. Soon enough, it would be released, and the direction it took would decide everything. Jane was queen then, in name and in ceremony, but her throne stood on sand. The proclamation had been made, the rituals performed, the title bestowed. Yet beneath the formal grandeur, the foundations were already shifting. The reign of 9 days had begun, though no one yet knew it would be counted in so few. And almost immediately, even within the close circle of her own court, Jane would find herself in conflict, not with her enemies, but with the very family that had placed her on the throne. Even in her brief reign, Jane showed flashes of the iron will beneath her quiet exterior. When it was suggested that her husband, Guilford Dudley, should be made king alongside her, Jane flatly refused. She would, she said, make him a duke if he wished, but the title of king was not hers to give away, and she would not hand the crown to the Dudley family so easily. It was a startling act of independence from a girl who had been moved around like a chess piece her whole life. For one shining moment, Jane was not a pawn, but a player. Unfortunately, the game itself was already lost. The matter of Guilford's title quickly became a genuine quarrel within the heart of Jane's court, and it revealed a great deal about both her character and the family that had installed her. The Dudleys naturally expected that Guilford would be made king. To them, the whole point of marrying their son to Jane had been to place a Dudley on the throne, and a mere consort's role was far beneath their ambitions. Guilford's mother in particular was reportedly furious at any suggestion that her son would be anything less than king, and she made her displeasure known in no uncertain terms. But Jane, to the surprise of everyone, would not bend. She seems to have understood, with that sharp instinct of hers, that the kingship was not a private gift to be handed out within a family. The crown matrimonial, she argued, was a matter for Parliament, not for her personal favour, and she would not simply declare her husband king on her own authority. She offered to make him a duke, a high honour by any measure, but she drew a firm line at the crown itself. It was hers, however unwillingly she had received it, and she would not give it away merely to satisfy the appetites of the Dudley clan. This was a remarkable stand. Here was a girl who had been overruled at every turn her entire life, who had been pinched into perfection, married against her will, and forced onto a throne she had begged to refuse, and yet now, in the one moment where she briefly held real authority, she used it to say no. She refused to be a mere conduit through which the Dudleys could seize ultimate power. For all that she'd been chosen precisely because she was supposed to be controllable, Jane proved, in this small but telling episode, that she had a will entirely her own. The reaction was predictably bitter. Guilford reportedly sulked and protested, and his formidable mother raged, even threatening to remove her son from Jane's bed and company in retaliation. The atmosphere within the court grew tense and poisonous, the new queen at odds with the very family that had engineered her rise. It was a strange, almost domestic squabble unfolding against the backdrop of a national crisis, two ambitious households bickering over a title while the ground beneath them was already beginning to give way. There is something quietly admirable and quietly heartbreaking in Jane's stubbornness here. She had so little power and so little time, and yet she chose to spend a portion of it defending a principle, insisting that the crown was not a trinket to be casually bestowed. It was the act of a young woman with genuine integrity, refusing to be merely an instrument even at the moment of her greatest supposed elevation. But integrity, like intelligence, could not save her. While the court busied itself with arguments over Guilford's title, the real danger was massing far away beyond the tower's walls. For even as Jane asserted her brief futile authority, Mary Tudor was on the move, and she was not arguing about titles, she was raising an army. As was tradition for a new monarch awaiting coronation, Jane took up residence in the Tower of London, that grand and grim fortress on the Thames. By day it was a royal palace, glittering with the trappings of power. But the tower wore two faces, and everyone in Tudor England knew it. Its thick walls had held countless prisoners, and its courtyards had soaked up the blood of the fallen, including not long before that of Jane's distant relation, Anne Boleyn. Jane walked into the tower as a queen. She did not yet know that she would never walk out of it again as a free woman. The Tower of London was, in Jane's day, far more than the dark prison of later legend. It was a working royal residence, a place where monarchs traditionally lodged in the days before their coronation, surrounded by luxury and ceremony. Its chambers could be furnished with all the splendour befitting a sovereign, and within its walls were stored the crown jewels and the great symbols of royal authority. When Jane entered as queen, she entered a place of power and majesty, the proper seat from which a new reign was meant to begin. There is a small, telling detail from these days. At some point during her brief residence, the crown itself was brought to Jane so that it might be fitted to her, and she reportedly recoiled from the gesture, reluctant even to try it on. The story goes that when it was suggested another crown might also be made for her husband, the full weight of what was happening seemed to settle on her, the realization that she was not merely a placeholder, but the centerpiece of a design meant to make the Dudleys kings. Even amid the palace splendour, the trap revealed its teeth, for the tower's two faces were never far apart. The same fortress that housed coronation finery also housed cells and scaffolds. Its history was soaked in the blood of the great and the fallen, men and women who had entered through its gates in triumph or in chains and never left alive. Among them, less than 2 decades earlier, had been Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, and a distant kinswoman of Jane's own line, who had walked these very grounds before kneeling to a French swordsman's blade. The echoes of such fates hung in the ancient stones. Jane, learned and perceptive as she was, could hardly have been unaware of the tower's darker character. She knew her history. She knew what these walls had witnessed. And though she arrived as a queen, attended and honoured, there must have been some part of her that felt the chill of the place, the sense of standing in a fortress that had so often turned palace into prison with the simple slam of a door. The line between the two was, as ever in Tudor England, terrifyingly thin. In the end, that line would vanish entirely for Jane. The chambers that housed her as a sovereign would, within mere days, become the cells that held her as a prisoner. She would not need to be moved to some distant dungeon. The tower would simply change its face, transforming around her from royal residence to place of captivity without her ever leaving its walls. It is one of the cruelest symmetries in her story, that the fortress which welcomed her as queen would also be the one to keep her until her death. For the moment, though, Jane remained the sovereign in residence, surrounded by the trappings of a power that was already slipping away. The palace had not yet become the prison, but the transformation was coming, and it was coming fast, carried on the rising tide of support that was even now gathering around the woman Jane herself had always called the rightful queen. While Jane sat uneasily upon her borrowed throne, Mary Tudor was doing the one thing Northumberland had failed to prevent. She was gathering an army. From her stronghold in East Anglia, Mary proclaimed herself the rightful queen and called the country to her side, and to the shock of the schemers in London the country answered. Nobles, commoners and soldiers flocked to her banner, drawn by loyalty to Henry VIII's true daughter and a deep distrust of Northumberland's naked ambition. The tide that Northumberland had spent so long trying to control was now turning against him with frightening speed, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Mary's response to the coup was a masterclass in nerve and timing. Having escaped Northumberland's attempt to capture her, she did not hide or hesitate. Instead, she planted herself firmly in the regions where her support ran deepest, raised her standard, and declared to the realm that she, the daughter of King Henry, was its lawful sovereign. From her base, eventually centred on the formidable stronghold of Framlingham, she sent out word across the country, summoning loyal men to her cause and challenging the legitimacy of the regime in London. What followed astonished nearly everyone, and it terrified the plotters most of all. The people came. They came in numbers and with a conviction that no clever legal document could match. Local gentry rode in with their tenants and retainers. Ordinary men took up arms. Towns declared for Mary. Ships and soldiers that had been meant to oppose her instead defected to her side. The groundswell of support was not manufactured or bought. It was the genuine, instinctive response of a population that believed deep in its bones that Mary was the rightful queen, and that a great wrong was being done in London. This was the very thing Northumberland's entire scheme had been designed to prevent, and it was happening anyway. He had gambled that he could present Jane's accession as an accomplished fact before opposition could organise, that the country would grumble but ultimately accept the new order. He had badly misjudged the depth of feeling for Mary and the depth of suspicion toward himself. To many, he was not a defender of the Protestant faith, but a grasping schemer attempting to steal the crown for his own family, and his unpopularity now worked powerfully against him. The momentum shifted with remarkable speed. What had looked, for a few days, like a successful coup began to reveal itself as a catastrophic miscalculation. Mary's strength grew by the hour, while support for Jane's regime in London proved shallow and brittle. The men who had signed the devise and proclaimed Jane Queen began privately to calculate their own survival, glancing nervously toward the east where Mary's forces were swelling. The whole structure that Northumberland had so carefully built was beginning to tremble. Northumberland understood the danger and resolved to meet it head-on, marching out at the head of an army to confront Mary directly and crush her rising, before it could become unstoppable. It was a desperate gamble, and in undertaking it he made a fatal error, for in leaving London to lead the campaign himself, he removed his own controlling presence from the capital, leaving the council and the city behind him to waver and reconsider. The spider had left the centre of his web. As Northumberland rode out to battle and Mary's support continued to surge, the doomed nature of Jane's reign was becoming undeniable. The Queen in the Tower, who'd never wanted her crown, now watched as the kingdom rallied to the woman she had always insisted was its rightful ruler. The held breath of England was about to be released, and when it was, it would not be in Jane's favour. Power in Tudor England was a fickle, faithless thing, and nothing proved it more brutally than what happened next. As Mary's support swelled and Northumberland's position crumbled, the very councillors who had sworn allegiance to Queen Jane began, one by one, to quietly change their minds. The men who had bowed to her, signed her proclamation, and pledged her their loyalty slipped away to declare for Mary instead. It was a betrayal so swift and so complete that it would have been almost comic if it weren't so cruel. Jane had been queen for barely more than a week, and already the floor was vanishing beneath her feet. The unravelling began the moment Northumberland left London to confront Mary in the field. As long as the Duke remained in the capital, his ruthless presence had held the council in line through a mixture of authority and fear. But with him gone, riding eastward at the head of his army, the men he left behind were free to think for themselves, and what they thought, increasingly, was that they had backed the losing side. Each piece of news from the country, each report of towns and nobles declaring for Mary, chipped away at their resolve. These were not men of deep principle. They were survivors, politicians who had risen by reading the winds and trimming their sails accordingly, and the winds were now blowing unmistakably toward Mary. The same counsellors who had knelt before Jane and addressed her as their sovereign began to calculate, coldly and privately, how they might extract themselves from a sinking cause before it dragged them under. Loyalty in their world was not a virtue but a wager, and the odds had shifted decisively. The defections, once they began, came as a flood. Under the pretext of various errands, counsellors slipped out of the tower and out of the city, gathering elsewhere to reconsider their position. Soon enough, the great men of the realm who had so recently sworn themselves to Queen Jane were openly declaring for Mary, falling over one another to be seen as her loyal supporters. They proclaimed Mary the rightful queen in the streets of London, and this time the crowds did not stand in sullen silence. This time the city erupted in genuine joy, with bonfires, ringing bells, and cheering throngs celebrating the triumph of the woman they had believed in all along. The contrast with Jane's own muted proclamation could not have been sharper. Where her accession had been met with unease and cold stares, Mary's was greeted with an outpouring of authentic delight. The difference was the verdict of a people who had never truly accepted Jane and who now seized the chance to declare their real allegiance. The council had simply caught up with what the country had felt from the very beginning. For Jane, still within the tower, the collapse must have unfolded with a surreal and dizzying speed. The deference that had surrounded her began to evaporate, the boos and the titles fading as her supposed servants and counsellors abandoned her cause. The throne she had never wanted was being pulled out from under her, not by enemies storming the gates, but by the very men who had placed her upon it, quietly slipping away to save their own skins. It was a perfect, bitter illustration of how hollow her power had always been. Jane had never truly ruled. She had merely occupied a position that others maintained for their own ends, and the moment those ends shifted, her queenship dissolved like mist. The council had turned its coat, and with that turning, the brief and tragic reign of Queen Jane was effectively over. All that remained was for someone to tell her so. On the 19th of July, 1553, just 9 days after she'd been proclaimed, Jane's reign came crashing to an end. Mary was declared the true queen. The bells of London rang out in genuine celebration, and the brief, doomed experiment of Queen Jane was over. Somewhere in the tower, the news reached Jane herself. Her response was, by all accounts, one of relief as much as fear, for she had never wanted the crown in the first place. But relief would prove short-lived. Surrendering a throne she never desired would not be enough to save her. In Tudor England, mercy was rarely so simple. The manner in which Jane learned of her own deposition carried a final, cruel irony. It was her own father, Henry Grey, the man whose ambition had helped place her on the throne, who came to deliver the news that her reign was finished. According to the accounts that have come down to us, he entered her chambers and, in a gesture as symbolic as it was brutal, tore down the cloth of estate, the canopy of royalty that marked her as queen. With that single act, he stripped away the last trappings of her sovereignty and told her, in effect, that she must content herself once more with a private life. Jane's reported reaction to this stunning reversal is one of the most revealing moments in her entire story. She did not rage or weep at the loss of her crown. Instead, she's said to have responded with something close to acceptance, even gratitude, observing that she relinquished the throne far more willingly than she had ever taken it. She'd been forced onto the throne against her conscience, and now she was being removed from it, and if anything, the removal aligned more closely with her own true wishes than the elevation ever had. But Jane was far too intelligent to mistake the end of her reign for the end of her danger. She understood. with that clear and unflinching sight of hers that stepping down from a crown she'd never desired would not simply restore her to a quiet life of books and study. She had been, however unwillingly, the figurehead of a treasonous attempt to deny Mary her rightful throne. In the brutal logic of the age that made her a threat, and threats, especially royal-blooded ones, were not easily forgiven simply because they expressed regret. The celebrations that swept through London at Mary's triumph were the joyful sound of a kingdom righting what it saw as a great wrong. But for Jane, those same ringing bells told the end of any illusion of safety. The throne that had been thrust upon her had transformed her from a private noblewoman into a public danger, a living symbol around whom future plots might gather. She had occupied the highest position in the land for the briefest of moments, and that brief occupation would shadow her for the rest of her short life. Meanwhile, the architect of the whole disaster was meeting his own swift end. Northumberland, his army melting away and his cause collapsed, was captured, and in a final humiliation, he himself proclaimed Mary Queen in a desperate bid to save his life. It did him no good. The man who had schemed to crown Jane and rule through her was condemned and executed within weeks, his grand design ending, as such design so often did, on the block. The shortest reign in English history was over. Jane had survived it, but survival in her situation was a fragile and temporary thing. The palace had welcomed her as a queen. Now, without her even leaving its walls, it was about to become her prison. In the span of a single day, Jane's status transformed completely. The rooms that had housed a queen now held a prisoner. The tower that had welcomed her with ceremony now locked its doors behind her. She was charged with treason for accepting a crown that, in the eyes of the new regime, had never been hers to take, even though she had been a reluctant and powerless participant in the whole affair. The cruel irony was almost unbearable. Jane was being punished most severely for the one crime she had committed least willingly. And in a kingdom ruled by suspicion, willingness was never really the point. The transformation required no grand relocation. Jane remained within the same fortress walls, but everything about her circumstances changed. The deference vanished, the title was stripped away, and the chambers that had been arranged for a sovereign awaiting coronation became in effect a place of confinement. She was now a prisoner of the very tower she had so recently entered as queen, held alongside her young husband Guilford, who had likewise tumbled from the heights of expectation into captivity. The charge laid against her was treason, the gravest offence in the realm, carrying with it the gravest of penalties. In the strict letter of the law, the case against Jane was clear enough. She had allowed herself to be proclaimed queen in opposition to the rightful sovereign, and she had signed documents in that capacity. That she had done so under enormous pressure, that she had wept and protested and tried to refuse, that she had been a tool in the hands of ruthless men, made no difference to the bare legal facts. She had worn a crown that was not hers, and for that the law demanded an answer. Here lies one of the central tragedies of Jane's story, the gap between guilt and culpability. By the cold standards of the law, she was guilty. She had indeed been a usurping queen, however briefly. But by any measure of true responsibility, she was among the most innocent figures in the entire affair. She had not schemed for the throne, she had been forced upon it. She had not desired the crown, she had begged to refuse it. The real architects of the treason were the men who had manipulated a dying king, pressured a reluctant girl, and gambled a kingdom on their own ambition. Jane had simply been the instrument they chose. Yet instruments, in the dangerous world of Tudor politics, could not always be safely set aside. As long as Jane lived, she remained a person of royal blood who had once been proclaimed queen, and that combination made her perpetually dangerous, regardless of her own wishes or her evident innocence of any real ambition. She was a symbol that could be picked up and used by others, a rallying point for anyone who might seek to challenge Mary in the future. That potential, more than any act she had personally committed, was what made her so perilous to keep alive. For now, though, Mary's instincts leaned toward leniency. The new queen seemed to recognise, as well she might, that Jane had been a victim of the scheme rather than its mastermind. There was a real possibility that Jane might be kept in honourable confinement for a time and eventually pardoned, her life spared in acknowledgement of her youth and her obvious lack of true guilt. So Jane settled into her captivity, the former queen now a prisoner, but a prisoner with at least some reason to hope. The doors had closed behind her, but they had not yet closed forever. Whether they ever opened again would depend not on what Jane had done, but on what others far beyond her control would do next. In November of 1553, Jane was put on trial for high treason. She was led through the cold streets to face her judges, a slight figure in dark clothing, still only a teenager, accused of crimes that powerful men had committed in her name. The outcome was never in doubt. The verdict was guilty, the sentence death, exactly as everyone had known it would be. And yet there was a flicker of hope buried within the grim formality. For all the harshness of the sentence, Mary herself seemed reluctant to actually carry it out against a young cousin who had so clearly been a pawn. For a time, it looked as though Jane might yet be spared. The trial was held at the Guildhall in London, and Jane was brought there under guard to answer the charges along with several others caught up in the failed coup, including her husband Guilford. She walked to her trial as a prisoner accused of the highest crime in the land, her royal blood now a liability rather than a protection. By the accounts that survive, she conducted herself with the same grave composure that had marked her whole life, dignified and self-possessed even as she faced judges empowered to condemn her to death. The proceedings followed the expected forms, but the conclusion was a foregone certainty. The legal facts were not really in dispute. Jane had been proclaimed queen against Mary's rightful claim, and documents bore witness to her brief reign. To plead her case in any real sense would have been pointless, for the charge described in stark legal terms exactly what had happened. The trial was less an inquiry into guilt than a formal ritual confirming a guilt that the law had already decided. Jane, clear-eyed as ever, can have harboured few illusions about the result. She was found guilty, as everyone had known she would be, and sentenced to death. The sentence pronounced upon her was the terrible one reserved for traitors of her sort, with the precise manner of execution left, as was customary, to the will of the sovereign. It was a chilling formality, a death sentence handed down upon a girl of 16 or 17 for a treason she had been forced into against her own pleading conscience. The machinery of the law had done its work, neatly and inexorably, and yet, crucially, the sentence was not the same as its execution. In Tudor England, a condemnation to death did not always end in death. Sentences could be suspended, prisoners could be held indefinitely, and royal mercy could intervene at any point. The pronouncement of guilt was a legal necessity, a formal acknowledgement that a crime had been committed, but it left open the vital question of whether the Queen would actually choose to enforce the ultimate penalty. On this point, there was genuine reason for hope. Mary, for all the gravity of what had occurred, appears to have understood perfectly well that Jane had been a victim of the scheme rather than its driving force. The new queen seems to have felt little personal animosity toward her young kinswoman, recognising in her a girl manipulated by ambitious men rather than a true rival hungry for the throne. There were strong indications that Mary intended in time to spare Jane's life, keeping her in confinement until the danger had passed and then granting her a pardon. So the trial, devastating as it was on paper, did not necessarily mean the end. Jane returned to her captivity in the Tower, a condemned woman, but a condemned woman with a real prospect of survival, her fate suspended between the harsh letter of the sentence and the merciful inclination of the Queen. For a while, that fragile hope held. It would take a new disaster and a fresh betrayal by her own family to finally extinguish it. Queen Mary was no monster, whatever later legend would make of her, and she understood perfectly well that Jane had been used. In the weeks after the trial, it seemed entirely possible that the young woman's life would be quietly spared, kept in comfortable confinement until the danger passed, and then, perhaps, eventually freed. Jane was, after all, family. She was a girl who had wept at her own crowning and surrendered her throne without a fight. For a brief window, mercy hovered within reach, close enough to touch. But fate and Jane's own family were about to slam that window shut with devastating force. It is worth pausing to correct the cartoon that history has sometimes made of Mary Tudor. The grim nickname by which she's often remembered came from later religious persecutions and a campaign of hostile memory, but in the autumn of 1553, Mary's treatment of Jane revealed a more complicated and, in this matter at least, a more humane figure. She had triumphed completely, her throne secured and her enemies scattered, and she was in a position to show clemency to a young kinswoman who'd so plainly been a tool rather than a true threat. Mary appears to have grasped the essential truth of Jane's situation with considerable clarity. She knew that the real villains were the men who had engineered the coup, the schemers who had manipulated a dying boy and pressured a reluctant girl. Jane herself, barely more than a child, had been the instrument of their ambition, not its author. There was no great personal hatred between the two women, and Mary seems to have felt that executing such an obvious pawn would be both unnecessary and unjust. The inclination toward mercy was real, and by most accounts genuine. So Jane remained in the Tower under conditions that were far from the squalor of a dungeon. She was confined, certainly, and her movements were restricted, but she was treated with a measure of consideration befitting her rank and her evident innocence of true ambition. She had her books, her studies, and her faith to sustain her, and she occupied her captivity much as she had occupied her freedom, with reading, reflection, and the steady practice of her religion. It was a strange kind of limbo, a condemned woman living quietly in expectation that her sentence might never be carried out. For a time this fragile arrangement held, and with each passing week that Jane remained alive and unharmed, the prospect of an eventual pardon must have seemed more plausible. The fury of the coup had subsided, Mary's grip on the throne had strengthened, and the urgency of dealing with Jane had faded. In a calmer world, this might well have been the path the story followed, with Jane spending some years in confinement before being quietly released to live out a private life, the 9 days queen reduced to a curious footnote rather than a martyr. But Jane's tragedy was that she was never free of the ambitions of others, even when she most desperately needed to be. Her own existence, her royal blood and her brief queenship made her a permanent temptation to those who might wish to challenge Mary, and that danger could be activated at any moment by forces entirely beyond Jane's control. She could be the most cooperative and harmless prisoner imaginable, and it would not matter, because her peril depended not on her own conduct, but on the actions of others who might choose to use her name. And so, even as mercy seemed within reach, these seeds of catastrophe were being sown elsewhere. A new rebellion was brewing, and at its edges, with breathtaking recklessness, stood the one man who should have been most desperate to keep his daughter safe. Early in 1554, a rebellion erupted against Queen Mary, led by a man named Thomas Wyatt, and sparked largely by anger over Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. The uprising was dangerous and it terrified the new regime. Worse still for Jane, her own father Henry Grey threw himself into the rebellion, taking up arms against the Queen. It was a catastrophic decision. By rebelling, he transformed his imprisoned daughter from a harmless former pawn into a living symbol that traitors might rally around. The man who had spent Jane's whole life using her for his ambitions had, in the end, signed her death warrant with his own reckless hands. The rebellion grew out of widespread unease about Mary's decision to marry Philip of Spain, a union that many in England feared would subject the country to foreign, Catholic domination. The prospect stirred deep anxieties about national independence and religious freedom, and it provided the spark for armed resistance. Thomas Wyatt raised a force and marched toward London, and for a frightening moment the rebellion posed a genuine threat to Mary's hold on power, throwing the capital into alarm and the court into fear. For Jane, sitting in her confinement with reasonable hope of eventual pardon, the rising was a disaster entirely not of her making. She had no part in it, no involvement, no knowledge that would implicate her. She was a prisoner, removed from the world, occupied with her books and her prayers, and yet the rebellion would prove fatal to her all the same, because of a single devastating fact. Her father had joined it. Henry Grey's decision to take up arms against the Queen ranks among the most reckless and unforgivable acts in this entire tragic story. Whatever his motives, he must have known, or should have known, that his daughter's life hung by a thread, dependent on Mary's continued mercy and on Jane being seen as harmless. By rebelling, by once more attaching the Grey name to treason against the crown, he shattered that fragile safety completely. He took a daughter who was very likely going to be spared and made her continued existence intolerable to the regime. The cruel logic was inescapable. As long as Jane lived, she was a figure of royal blood who had once been proclaimed queen, and now her own family had demonstrated in the most violent way possible that the Greys remained willing to challenge Mary's throne. Jane became, in an instant, not a forgivable pawn, but a permanent and unacceptable danger, a banner that rebels had shown they would rally around. The very mercy that had been extended to her now looked like an unaffordable risk. Every day she remained alive was a day she might be used again, and the Wyatt rebellion had proven the threat was real. There is a terrible symmetry in the fact that it was her father, of all people, who delivered the final blow. Henry Grey had pushed and shaped and bartered Jane her entire life, treating her as an asset to advance the family's fortunes. He had helped place her on the doomed throne in the first place. And now, with one last act of selfish recklessness, he removed the only thing standing between his daughter and the executioner. The man who should have done anything to protect her instead did the one thing guaranteed to destroy her. Mary's advisers pressed hard upon her now, arguing that Jane could no longer be allowed to live, that mercy had become a luxury the throne could not afford. The window that had stayed open through the autumn and into the winter was being forced shut, and this time it would not open again. The decision that Mary had so long resisted could be delayed no longer. After Wyatt's rebellion, mercy was no longer possible. As long as Jane lived, she would remain a banner for every plotter and rebel who opposed Mary's rule, a permanent threat the Queen could not afford to ignore. Reluctantly, and under heavy pressure from her advisers, Mary signed the order for Jane's execution. The decision was political, cold, and in the brutal logic of the age perhaps inevitable. But it fell upon a girl of barely 16 or 17 who had done almost nothing of her own free will. The warrant was sealed, the date was set, and nothing now could turn it back. The decision to proceed with the execution was, by all indications, one that Mary reached with genuine reluctance. She had resisted it for months, inclined towards sparing the young woman she knew to be more victim than villain. But the rebellion had changed the calculation entirely, and the voices around her now spoke with a single urgent message. Jane was too dangerous to live. Her continued existence, they argued, would forever invite further plots, and the security of the throne demanded that the threat be removed permanently. Against such pressure, and in the wake of armed treason that had touched her own family, Mary's mercy finally gave way. There is no real doubt that Mary acted from political necessity rather than personal vengeance. She had every opportunity to hate Jane, and had largely declined to do so, recognising the girl's innocence of true ambition. But a monarch's choices were rarely her own alone, and the brutal arithmetic of survival in a contested age left little room for sentiment. A queen who had nearly been overthrown could not afford to keep alive a rival figurehead, however blameless that figurehead might personally be. The logic was merciless, and it was, within the terrible terms of the time, difficult to refute. And so the order was given, and the date of Jane's death was set. The condemnation that had hung over her since her trial, suspended for so long by the hope of pardon, now hardened into an immovable certainty. There would be no rescue, no reprieve, no last-moment clemency. The girl who had begged to refuse the crown, who had surrendered it gladly, who had lived quietly and harmlessly in her captivity, was now to pay the ultimate price for a treason that others had authored in her name. In a final act that has struck observers across the centuries as both cruel and strangely earnest, Mary sent her own chaplain, a learned and kindly man named Feckenham, to attend Jane in her final days. His purpose was to persuade Jane to abandon her Protestant faith and return to the Catholic Church, so that, in Mary's sincere belief, the young woman's soul might be saved even as her body was destroyed. It was, in its way, an act of genuine concern, however unwelcome, the gesture of a deeply religious queen who could not bear the thought of a kinswoman dying in what she regarded as error. Jane, of course, refused. With the same iron conviction that had defined her whole life, she would not surrender the faith that was the very core of her being, not even to please the woman who held the power of life and death over her. She debated the matter with Feckenham steadily and courteously, holding her ground without rancour, and by most accounts the two developed an unexpected mutual respect across the gulf of their disagreement. She would die as she had lived, a devout Protestant, unmoved in her belief. The warrant could not be unsigned. The date was fixed, the faith unchanged, the outcome certain. All that remained for Jane now was to prepare herself for the end, and to face it, as she faced everything, with a composure that would astonish all who witnessed it. In her final hours she turned, as she always had, to words. In her final days Jane revealed the full depth of the character that her short, controlled life had so rarely been allowed to show. She wrote with calm, clear-eyed courage, leaving behind letters of striking maturity and faith. She wrote to her father, who had helped condemn her, expressing forgiveness even as she faced the consequences of his choices. She wrote in her prayer book, leaving words of quiet conviction for those who would come after. There was no hysteria, no collapse, only a steady, almost unsettling composure. Faced with death, the girl who had been a pawn her entire life finally became the master of the one thing left to her: how she would meet the end. The letter she wrote to her father is among the most remarkable documents of her short life. Henry Grey, by his reckless involvement in the rebellion, had effectively doomed her, and a lesser soul might have filled such a letter with bitterness and reproach. Jane did the opposite. She wrote to him not with anger, but with forgiveness, expressing her sorrow at his situation and offering him comfort even as she prepared for her own death. She framed her coming execution not as a tragedy to rage against, but as a release, a passage from a troubled life to a better one, and she sought to ease her father's grief rather than to wound him with blame. It was an extraordinary act of grace, the more so given how thoroughly her father had failed her. The man who had pushed her toward the throne, who had helped place the doomed crown upon her head, and who had finally sealed her fate through his own folly, received from his condemned daughter not condemnation but consolation. In those lines, Jane displayed a moral seriousness and a depth of forgiveness that put to shame nearly every adult who had shaped her brief and tragic existence. She also left words for her younger sister, written into the small prayer book she carried, a final message of faith and farewell. In it, she urged her sister to live a godly life, to hold fast to her beliefs, and to be prepared for death whenever it might come, drawing on the same religious conviction that had sustained Jane throughout her ordeal. These were not the words of a frightened child, but of a young woman who had thought deeply about life, death, and faith, and who faced her own end with a clarity that few of any age ever achieve. Throughout these final days, Jane's composure remained unbroken. She continued her debates with the chaplain Feckenham, holding firmly to her Protestant beliefs while treating him with courtesy and warmth. The respect between them deepened to such a degree that Jane reportedly came to value his company, and there is an account that she asked him to accompany her to the scaffold itself, a poignant testament to the strange human bond that had formed between the condemned Protestant girl and the Catholic priest sent to convert her. Their disagreement was absolute, yet it had not hardened into hatred. In all of this, one sees the true Jane emerging at last, no longer the silent instrument of others' ambitions, but a person of genuine substance, courage, and conviction. The qualities that had been so relentlessly shaped and exploited throughout her life, her learning, her faith, her self-possession, now served her in the one arena where she finally had control, the manner of her own death. She could not choose whether to die, but she could choose how, and she chose dignity, forgiveness, and unshakable faith. The letters were written, the farewells made, the faith affirmed. Jane had set her affairs in order with a maturity that belied her years. Now there remained only the final mourning and the terrible grief that would precede her own end, for she would have to endure the loss of her young husband before she faced the blade herself. On the morning of the 12th of February 1554, Jane's young husband, Guilford Dudley, was led out to a public execution on Tower Hill. Jane is said to have watched from her window as he was taken away, and later as his body was carried back, a horror no teenage bride should ever have to witness. The two of them had been bound together not by love but by the schemes of their families, and now they were bound together in death as well, separated by only a few short hours. Guildford's execution was the grim opening act. Jane's own was now only moments away. The arrangement of their deaths followed the conventions of the age, which drew careful distinctions of rank and circumstance even in the matter of execution. Guilford, as a man and a commoner in the eyes of the law despite his noble family, was to die publicly on Tower Hill, outside the fortress walls, where crowds could gather to witness the fate of a traitor. Jane, by contrast, was to be executed privately within the tower itself, on Tower Green, a small mercy granted in recognition of her royal blood and former status. The same distinction had once spared Anne Boleyn the spectacle of a public death. For Jane, the timing of the two executions created a final, exquisite cruelty. Guildford was to die first, and Jane would be left to face the immediate aftermath of his death in the brief interval before her own. By the accounts that have come down to us, she may have been offered the chance to meet with him one last time before the end, but she declined, reportedly feeling that such a meeting would only increase the anguish for them both, and that they would soon be reunited in a better place where no earthly grief could reach them. There is a tradition that Jane watched from a window as her husband was led out toward Tower Hill, a young man walking to his death through the cold February morning. And there is the even more harrowing account that she also witnessed his body being brought back afterward, carried on a cart, the bloody evidence of what awaited her too now passing beneath her gaze. Whether every detail of these accounts is precisely accurate, the essential horror is clear. A girl of 16 or 17, about to be executed herself, forced to confront the violent death of the husband she'd been given against both their wills. The marriage between Jane and Guilford had never been a love match. It had been arranged by ambitious families for political advantage. Two young people pushed together as pieces in a larger game. They had quarrelled, notably over the question of his title, and there is little evidence of deep affection between them. And yet, whatever the nature of their bond, they had shared an extraordinary and terrible fate, lifted together to the dizzying heights of a throne, and cast down together into captivity and death. In the end, they were united not by romance but by tragedy, two victims of the same ruthless scheme. Now, with Guilford dead, Jane stood utterly alone at the edge of her own ending. The grim opening act was complete, the crowds on Tower Hill dispersing, the cart with its dreadful burden returned. There was nothing left to delay the inevitable. The young woman who had endured so much, who had been used and overruled and finally condemned for the ambitions of others, now had only to walk the short distance to her own scaffold and face the blade with the courage she had shown through every dark hour that had led her here. The final moment had come. Tower Green waited. Within the relative privacy of the tower walls on Tower Green, Jane was brought to her own scaffold. She spoke briefly and steadily to those gathered, acknowledging that she had wrongfully accepted the crown but insisting she had never sought it, and asking those present to bear witness that she died a faithful Christian. Then, blindfolded, she reached out for the block and for one heart-stopping moment could not find it, crying out for help in the sudden darkness. Guided gently into place, she spoke her final words, commending her spirit into God's hands. And so, at no more than 16 or 17 years old, the girl who'd been queen for 9 days passed quietly into history, a victim of other people's ambitions and a martyr who would never be forgotten. She walked to the scaffold with a composure that astonished all who watched, carrying her prayer book and accompanied by the chaplain Feckenham and her weeping attendants. Where others in her position had faltered, Jane remained steady, her years of discipline and her deep faith holding her upright through the most terrible morning of her life. She'd been preparing for this, in a sense, through every hardship she'd endured, and now she met it with the quiet strength that had always lived beneath her gentle surface. Standing upon the scaffold, she addressed the small gathering with clarity and honesty. She admitted that she'd done wrong in accepting the crown, that her acceptance had been unlawful, but she insisted, as she always had, that she had never desired it nor sought it of her own will. She asked those present to witness that she died a true Christian woman, trusting in her faith for salvation. There was no false defiance in her words and no grovelling, only a measured and truthful accounting from a young woman determined to leave the world with her conscience clear and her beliefs intact. She then knelt and recited a psalm, the ancient plea for mercy, in English, her voice steady to the last. It was after this, as she prepared for the final moment, that the most heart-rending detail of all unfolded. She handed her gloves and her prayer book to those attending her, and her head was bound with a cloth to blind her eyes. Then kneeling, she reached out for the block on which she must lay her head, and in the darkness of the blindfold she could not find it. For a terrible instant she groped helplessly, crying out to ask where it was, what she should do. It is an image of almost unbearable poignancy, a frightened girl in the dark, alone at the very threshold of death, reaching for the instrument of her own end. Someone present guided her hands to the block, and she laid herself down. Her last words were a quiet expression of faith, commending her spirit into the hands of God, the same simple, profound trust that had carried her through everything. And then the blade fell, and Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days' Queen, was gone. Her short and sorrowful life ended within the walls of the fortress that had so briefly housed her as a sovereign. She was buried close by, in the small chapel within the tower, laid to rest near others who had met their ends on those same grounds. She had been a pawn in the hands of ruthless men, used and discarded in a game she had never wished to play. But in the manner of her death, in her courage, her forgiveness, and her unwavering faith, she became something far greater than a pawn. The girl who had begged to refuse a crown found, at the very end, a dignity that no crown could ever have bestowed, and in losing her life so young and so unjustly, she gained a place in memory that has endured for centuries. So as the candles gutter low and the last echoes of that cold February morning fade into silence, take a moment to think about the girl at the centre of it all. Lady Jane Grey lived for perhaps 16 or 17 years, and for 9 of her final days she was Queen of England, though she never wanted to be. She was born into the wrong family at the worst possible moment, raised with more correction than tenderness, married against her will, and forced onto a throne she begged to refuse. She was used by ambitious men, condemned for their crimes, and finally doomed by the very father who should have protected her. Almost nothing in her short life was ever truly her own choice, and yet, when everything else had been stripped away, Jane held on to the one thing no one could take from her. She forgave her father. She comforted her grieving attendants. She held to her faith without wavering, debated it with courtesy, and faced the blade with a composure that left hardened witnesses in tears. The girl who had been a pawn her whole life met her death as something far greater, and in doing so she earned a place in memory that no crown could ever have given her. We live in a gentler world now, one where most of us get to choose our own paths, our own beliefs, our own quiet evenings like this one. So tonight, as you sink into your soft, warm bed, safe and unbothered, spare a thought for the brilliant, lonely young woman who read Plato by candlelight and dreamed of nothing more than to be left in peace. She was never allowed that peace in life. Perhaps in some small way we can offer it to her now. Rest easy. Good night.